Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on citing energy transition infrastructure in transportation rights of way. My name is Jason Beckfield. I'm a professor of sociology at Harvard University. I am also a member of the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability, who are the excellent and generous hosts for this webinar series. We're delighted that you were able to join us. I will share my screen now. So I'm very excited about this webinar today because I think it combines um, sectors that are clearly very important to climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation and resilience in a way that I find is creative and in a way that I think tends to get pretty positive responses from the transportation communities and energy communities of people who are involved in changes like these. Um, so I want to welcome you all and also thank my colleagues, Christine, Laura, Beverly, and Thais for helping to make this happen. The Salata Institute has been wonderful about continuing the excellent DOT Climate Change Center webinar series that got off to such a strong start a couple of years ago and really built some great momentum and was very effective, I think, at sharing very good policy analysis and good science with transportation policymakers and transportation project doers around the country. And so I'm delighted that we're able to keep this going. Today, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about energy transition technology in transportation rights of way. And I'm so happy to welcome our three distinguished presenters today. First up will be Tina Hodges, who's now a senior policy analyst with clean transportation at Atlas Public Policy. Second will be Jessica O, Deputy Director in the Office of Sustainability and Health at the Minnesota DOT, and Rajan, who's the Vice President of So Green HVDC Link, as well as a principal at IndyNext LLC. And so we'll start with kind of a national perspective and move on to a state perspective and then move on to a project perspective. So I'm excited that we have those different takes on using transportation infrastructure for citing energy transition technology. At the outset, I do want to mention to everyone that we are planning on creating a new website to make a variety of resources available to people in state DOTs, regional MPOs, as well as private organizations. You can see the link for the various resources that have been archived in various places around greenhouse gas emission calculations, around adaptation plans, and especially the climate strategies that work. Several of those websites are still up and still existing. Others are in places that are a little bit more difficult to use. We're planning on tooling up a much more easy to use website that will make these public resources available to folks, more available to folks. So before turning it over to Tina, I want to just make a few points related to my own work on bringing a social science research perspective to decarbonizing transportation and to decarbonizing energy systems. I've been working on, both the supply and the demand side of this question of decarbonization for a while. And what I find is that many of the social processes that are important to decarbonization apply to both the demand side and the supply side. And so before I turn it over to Tina, this is my plea to remember the people in transportation and energy systems. I think a conceptual language from the field that can help is to think about the ways in which people relate to transportation and how they relate to energy. These things have complex histories in what transportation systems and energy systems mean to people. Employment is just one of the ways that people relate to these systems. Mobility is a kind of social relationship. The concept of a view shed, particularly for highly visible elements of infrastructures, tend to matter to people. And then I think many communities have concerns about the distribution of burdens of various infrastructure investments. And so those social relationships, I think, are important to the successes of these kinds of projects. I want to offer some resources as well that are available online. At the Salata Institute, we did a big project, finished a big project last year on how it is that grid projects get stuck. Spoiler alert, a lot of them get stuck because they don't use transportation infrastructure. They don't even try to use transportation infrastructure. And so that is a topic that comes up, especially when we call forth community voices about what kinds of changes communities would like to see. There's also a terrific white paper that the US DOT released back in January called Land Use as a Strategy for Transportation, Housing, and the Environment. I recommend that as a good resource too. You may be wondering, okay, if I wanted to look at the social dimensions of siting energy transition in transportation rights of way, what would I do? A simple, cheap tool for understanding how people in their communities relate to these things is the photo voice technique. Photovoice.org is a great website that takes you through, how to apply it, where to apply it, when to apply it. And then, of course, with any kind of a project, of the scale that these projects tend to be, community engagement turns out to be an important part of a successful, project rollout. I want to point out here the social science literature, for instance, that exists on trust building, trust rebuilding, trust repair. And then there's actually a number of cutting edge projects that are on different mechanisms of community engagement. One of them is the hyperlocal approach of Tyler Harrison, which is very helpful for project level advice about doing engagement. But the bottom line, if I were to take like everything I know about community engagement and boil it down to just one sentence, I would say that the earlier you can do it, the better, and the more open you can do it, the better regarding what kind of engagement you can actually do. In my experience, energy communities and transportation communities really don't so much mind, that they're unable to be engaged in, full-blown decision-making roles or, power sharing roles. But what they really don't like is being misled at the beginning of a project, or being, told that they can participate in a way that ultimately they can't. If it's more about information sharing kind of community engagement, then folks can just say that. Okay, more than enough from me. I will turn it over to Tina now, and I will stop my screen share. I do want to encourage everyone to use the Q&A function to ask questions. If they're quick clarification things, I'll invite the panelists to respond to those questions as they can. I'll try to respond too. But in general, we'll hold the discussion of bigger questions, meatier topics until the end. Okay, with that, Tina Hodges, please take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Is my screen showing? Okay, great. So my name is Tina Hodges, and I'm a senior policy analyst at Atlas Public Policy. I recently joined Atlas after many years working for the U.S. Department of Transportation on climate change and transportation policy. For those of you who aren't familiar with Atlas Public Policy, we are a data and policy research firm that equips businesses and policymakers with data and analysis to make strategic, informed decisions that serve the public interest. Today, I'm excited to speak on the topic of clean energy generation, transmission, and storage along highway and rail corridors. In my presentation today, I'll first provide a big picture view, then I'll provide a few case studies, and then I'll end with some technical assistance resources that you may find useful. But first, I'd like to step back and take a really big picture view of transportation past, present, and future. Transportation past. This is what transportation in the 19th century looked like. Slow, difficult, and full of horse pollution. In the 20th century, we saw rapid expansion of the highway network, which helped people and goods travel fast and far, but also came with negative impacts, including congestion, bulldozing through urban communities, air pollution, deaths on our roads, and inability to get around if you were too young, too old, or couldn't afford to buy a car. In the 21st century, we're moving towards a broader vision, one that includes transportation options that work for all people, 8-year-olds and 80-year-olds alike. And I have one of each of those in my household, and getting around with them in a system that wasn't built for them can be an adventure. But communities across the country are talking about a future where you have the freedom to cross the street, even if you're a little slower as you're older in age. You have the freedom to drive to the grocery store or bike to school without worrying that you'll be one of the 40,000 annual fatalities on US roads. A future where you'll have access to affordable and efficient public transportation, and where we'll have clean electric vehicles powered with renewable energy able to charge on a convenient national network. State and local transportation agencies have been articulating this broader vision more and more over the past couple of decades. You'll see it in agency strategic plans, metropolitan long-range transportation plans, state electric vehicle roadmaps, and more. And you'll see it on the street. For example, in these photos of electric vehicle fast chargers in Wisconsin, and this photo of a dedicated bus and bike lane in Washington, D.C. These are things that were not in existence when I was growing up. And despite what my kids say, I'd like to think that I'm not that old. To meet the challenge of transportation electrification, state DOTs are deploying electric vehicle charging, and some are starting to think about the demand that those electric vehicles will have on the electricity grid, especially if you're thinking about heavy-duty trucks using fast chargers along the side of along the interstate. And the demand that those electric vehicles will have on the grid, they're also thinking about opportunities to co-locate electricity transmission along highways and use excess land along the roadside to generate clean energy. And while it's not the traditional bailiwick of transportation agencies to tackle clean energy, some agencies are doing so. Here we see solar panels at an interchange on Interstate 85 in Georgia. We also see a solar canopy shading passengers at a bus stop and parking garage, and electricity transmission along a highway. Instead of a transmission developer needing to negotiate with thousands of landowners, if there's an opportunity to site along a highway corridor, then they only need to negotiate with the State Department of Transportation. And also, communities typically would prefer that transmission infrastructure be sited along highways because it's an existing, disturbed use of the land. So these types of projects bring a lot of benefits. They're really triple wins. They help the environment by allowing us to replace more polluting forms of energy with clean renewables. They save money. Solar energy is cheaper, and transportation agencies can save money on their electricity bills, as well as generate revenue from utility permits and land leasing. And these projects create good jobs. But these projects do not implement themselves. It takes champions on the ground fighting for them, and public agencies working across silos and partnering with the private sector. And sometimes we run into arcane regulations and we run into agencies that are used to doing things in a certain way. And I can tell you for that Georgia project, when I worked at the Federal Highway Administration trying to explain across offices how the utility and realty regulations could be applied to make it easier, there were people who were not happy with me. They were telling me I was speaking out of turn and stepping on toes. And the Georgia DOT, Georgia Power, and the nonprofit that pushed for this project, they faced even more consternation than I did. But they got it done. And more projects in more states are happening as well. I'll share with you a handful of examples from different parts of the country and some lessons learned. The Maine Department of Transportation was motivated by a statewide goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030. They had strong pressure from their governor to do something, to do whatever they can as a transportation agency to reduce emissions. And one of the things that they identified that they could do is develop renewable energy along the right of way. So they deployed 3 solar arrays, 2 at exits along Interstate 95, and this is a picture of one of them here on the screen, and 1 at the Augusta State Airport. Construction on these projects was completed in 2023, and they total 8 megawatts of solar power, which is enough to power 1,000 homes. They used a power purchase agreement. So under that type of agreement, the solar developer finances, constructs, owns, and operates the solar array. So the DOT does not have to take on those tasks that they're not really set up to do. And also they don't have to provide an upfront payment. And the DOT benefits over time by receiving savings on their electricity bills. In fact, Maine DOT estimates that they'll save over $8 million over the lifetime of this project. And that's all with zero upfront cost. Massachusetts Department of Transportation was one of the earlier examples. In fact, the Maine Department of Transportation modeled some of their work off of what Massachusetts found to be successful. The Massachusetts solar arrays were developed between 2013 and 2020. They used power purchase agreement, which I just explained a moment ago. And their solar arrays total 4.3 megawatts at 8 different sites, most of which are along the Massachusetts Turnpike. They estimate that these solar arrays reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 2.3 tons annually. And also that the solar arrays save their agency $6,000 every year in reduced electricity costs. The Public Transportation Agency for Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, SEPTA, also has a strong sustainability program. They have 2.3 megawatts of solar generation on 3 different rooftops of their maintenance facilities. They also have 42 megawatts, which is a lot, 42 megawatts of capacity on 2 off-site solar farms, I mean to say. And SEPTA was also an early adopter of wayside energy storage. And what that is when you have essentially a battery alongside an electric rail transit system, and the battery captures the energy generated from braking. And then the agency can discharge the energy from the battery to the grid at opportune times, such as, in the middle of the day on a 100-degree day in August to run air conditioners. So now I'm going to transition to talking about a transmission project. We'll need many miles of additional transmission to help us increase renewable energy on the electricity grid, especially to take solar and wind from where it's produced to areas where there's high demand for energy. So this project that I'm talking about right here is the Champlain Hudson Power Express. It's a planned HVDC transmission line. So HVDC is high voltage direct current, basically a lot of power moving very efficiently. And the line is to run from Quebec to New York City, and it will connect Canadian renewable energy from hydroelectric power with demand for electricity in New York City, some 340 miles away. The line is going to be buried, so there won't be visual impacts, and they're also good for safety. It will be primarily underwater along 60% of the route, and then the rest of the route it will be in highway and railroad right of way. So the developer worked very closely with the New York State Department of Transportation and also with this should say CSX and Canadian Pacific Railroads. Construction began in 2022 and they expect it to be completed in 2026. In terms of benefits, the project is anticipated to save New York homes and businesses $17.3 billion in electricity costs over 30 years. It's also anticipated to create 1,400 jobs and reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 1.5 million tons. So I'm transitioning now to the kind of supporting services part of the presentation. There are some U.S. Department of Transportation funding opportunities. Some of the big formula programs have very broad eligibility. So for instance, the National Highway Performance Program, which funds highway construction and maintenance. It also includes eligibility for underground public utility infrastructure as part of highway projects. So that is good to know. Also, the Carbon Reduction Program, which was new under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, it includes eligibility for alternative uses of the right-of-way to reduce carbon emissions, such as solar arrays or vegetation management. CRISI, or the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Program under the Federal Railroad Administration, includes eligibility for renewable energy projects on railroad property and right-of-way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the State Planning and Research Program includes eligibility for planning for clean energy and transmission projects. Now I'll talk about some technical assistance and tools that may be of use to you. The Pacific Northwest National Lab and the US DOT Volpe Center have funding from the Department of Energy and the Department of Transportation to do an electric transmission and transportation rights-of-way gap analysis. So this analysis is comparing transportation and transmission planning, funding, and permitting processes. It's looking at where the pain points are and what can be done to reduce those pain points. As part of the project, there was a workshop at the National Academy of Sciences just last month. So this will document the results of that workshop, but there's also on their website, the National Academy of Sciences website, you can look at the presentations from that from that workshop at that link there. And this report that I'm mentioning is due to be completed in summer 2025. So the map here on the slide is just showing you an example of the type of information and analysis that they're doing. So kind of the old school way of thinking was that highways are only for transportation purposes. But more and more transportation agencies have been thinking about how they can provide multiple benefits to the community. So some states still have prohibitions on siting electricity transmission along highway corridors in the right of way. But there's also quite a few where it's generally permitted. And then there's some where it's permitted at the discretion of the DOT. The RAY is a nonprofit which offers technical assistance to transportation agencies on sustainability. They have this right-of-way solar mapping tool that they developed with Esri. This is a screenshot of that tool, so you can see that lovely red area. The tool has identified that would be a great spot to put solar. It's a south-facing slope, and I think it's showing that there aren't existing trees along most of it, so you wouldn't even have to cut down any trees. So it gets to a pretty good level of detail. They also have a mapping tool for right-of-way electricity transmission. And the link to the organization is very simple, theray.org. They also did a national analysis of potential for solar generation along highways and found that the lower 48 states have 52,000 acres of land at interstate exits suitable for solar, which could generate 36 terawatt hours of energy per year, which is enough to power 12 million electric vehicles. Pretty impressive. I would be remiss if I didn't mention my own company's tools. Atlas Public Policy also has a number of tools that you might find helpful. The one I'm highlighting here is the Climate Program Portal. This is free to public sector employees. It tracks federal funding for climate change related programs and includes analysis, spotlight stories, briefs, and reports. So I hope you'll check it out. So that ends my presentation, and now you get to hear the much more interesting and fabulous parts with the people who are actually on the ground making things happen. So I'm very excited to hear from Jessica and from Raj, and I'm sure you are too.
Fantastic, Tina. Thank you so much. I just want to welcome Jessica O of Minnesota Department of Transportation, and I completely, share Tina's enthusiasm for what we learn from people who are doing projects on the ground in a live kind of way. I'm actually working on a book right now that is on the social aspects of actually doing decarbonization projects, and I think talking with folks like Jessica and Raj is very, very valuable for that understanding. So Jessica, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jason and Tina. Can everybody hear me okay? See my screen? Looking good? Okay, fantastic. Well, it's such a pleasure to be here today. My name is Jessica O. I'm the Deputy Director with the Office of Sustainability and Public Health at the Minnesota Department of Transportation. It's my pleasure today to get a chance to share with you the journey that we've gone through in Minnesota in the last 4 years, kind of digging into these topics, really determining, what are these barriers? Really, I like to think of this effort in the last 4 years as, really helping, figure out what is the connection, what's the nexus between energy and transportation. How can we remove those barriers and really understand the needs? Of course, as you all know, Captain Obvious here, but after our people who do the hard work of transportation every day, our right of way is our second most precious asset. And we can leverage it to meet other pressing needs in our country. And I think we're called upon to do so. And so there might be some speaking out of turn, as I think Tina, you're in good company with speaking out of turn. But I think we are in a place where we're being called upon to really look at these assets and see how they can be leveraged to help us have a better future. So for the last 4 years, the Minnesota Department of Transportation, which we call MnDOT, has been digging in with some national partners with the RAY. The same folks that Tina shared are those that are really providing a lot of thought leadership and expertise on these topics is the RAY, the Next Gen Highways Coalition, Great Plains Institute. Other partners are really trying to bring together these two industries and say, how do we work together to have a decarbonized future? So as part of that, we had a Sustainable Transportation Advisory Council that called upon MnDOT to dig into these topics. And so the primary questions when we started were, can we learn each other's needs? Can we understand each other's language, our time frames, the constraints? Really, it took a lot of time for us to even just understand each other as industries and how we're doing the work. We looked at this as how can we help address and maybe even remove significant decarbonization barriers that affect us both jointly. I think our fates are intertwined in an electrified future and for quality of life and for air quality and the rest of it. But we really wanted to dig into the technical, regulatory, and economic barriers to siting of transmission, whether that's buried HVDC or above ground infrastructure. Our Public Utility Commission asked us to really contemplate all of that. And so to do that, we activated a big cross-agency working group of about 12 offices at MnDOT, as well as our Public Utility Commission, our Department of Commerce, our Division Office of Federal Highways, to really dig into these topics, to analyze risk, to understand the current state, to really deeply try to understand energy and what the need was of why is this our problem? I say that with love in my heart, but the why is this our problem question keeps coming up. So we wanted to understand really what is the need that we're trying to address. So, why should we care? Well, this was a big part of our learning, and I continue to underscore it because I think that transportation folks are deeply, we live in this space where we're not concerned about energy. We're not thinking about energy, and how we contemplate utility accommodation, isn't, doesn't always lead with the energy perspective in mind. But the reality is, I'm sure if you've picked up any piece of media in the last few years, you know that the need for electricity and clean electricity in our country is going to double. And this is due to many factors. This is data centers, this is manufacturing, this is AI, this is a huge range of different activities, and electrification. This is the fact that just like transportation, they have an aging grid that needs to be upgraded, it needs to be modernized, it needs to be climate resilient, just like transportation. And they have the added issue of, how can we move power around cleanly through interregional transmission? But this has to do with our economic future as a country, our energy security, and the reliability that we all deeply care about every day to keep our economy moving forward. And in Minnesota, these mega data centers, they're being proposed, and they're, one data center could equal entire communities full of electricity needs, and these needs are increasing. And so we have to be able to understand that the siting of transmission is kind of the boondoggle part in some ways of energy, that those renewable energy generation sources of wind and solar, you got to connect those to the grid. You got to site that transmission, and that's one of the hardest parts. This is where what's coming down the pike is important, because there is billions of dollars of resources flowing to site transmission and in transmission investment. In the Midwest, our regional transmission operator is called MISO, and it covers a big, I think there's 13 or 14 states that it covers. And there are these huge waves of investment. I think it totals almost $30 billion of investment. So we need more transmission to connect all these huge new renewable energy sources. So it's a major objective, and siting of transmission is a challenge. This is where use of rights of way come in. So what problem, why are we in it? Why do we have skin in the game? It's, well, certainly in the state of Minnesota, electrification is a core strategy within our carbon reduction strategy and to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. So, if we can't support electrification, we aren't helping reduce those emissions directly. We've also had a couple of years of fairly significant advanced action legislatively around all of our renewable and our kind of climate future. And that has involved also a law that was passed in 2023 that all electricity must be generated from renewable energy sources in the state of Minnesota by 2040. And that has lit a fire in our state in order to kind of supercharge this. But ultimately, we understand that, that all of this will support the goals of transportation electrification, which is the future. So we started these conversations really broadly, where folks said, why wouldn't you use rights of way to site transmission? And they look at the right of way, and all they see is blank space. Let's fill it. Took us quite a bit of time to get to educate those on what you're seeing is not just blank space. Oh, sorry. That should be previous. I'm so sorry. It looks like there's a weird automation in there. But if you actually understand the demands on this roadside, there are dozens and dozens of uses that are naked to, if you don't know transportation, you just see grass. But in reality, there's, very complicated conveyance of water happening. There is, clear zones, there's protected habitat species, there's snow storage, there's extensive buried utilities, you name it. These are working lands. They have intelligent transportation infrastructure to help us have safer rights of way. So, you might not see it, but there are many, many demands on our land. And it took quite a bit for us to educate those in energy of really what you see here. So for those 4 years, what we've really come to arrive at is a shared understanding of what are some of that kind of basket of pressure points. And for us, where we landed was that, first and foremost, as Tina said, the old view is, transportation must be limited to transportation purpose. And so anything that limits our ability to expand into the future to meet those transportation purposes is challenging. And that's part of our ethos, part of who we are. But more than that, though, we are concerned about safety. We're concerned about adding items that are going to, increase the risk of the traveling public. We're concerned about the safety of our own maintenance workers. We're concerned about the costs that we could have to bear that might be unseen, and how do we pay for those costs, because this will complicate the delivery of the transportation system. We also were concerned about what happens if we need to recall that right of way for transportation purpose. With utility accommodation, if we say you have to go often, you have to go. And so when you're thinking about a $2 billion transmission line, it starts to get very complicated. But what happens in those instances where we really need to use the rights of way for its original purpose? We're concerned about our view sheds, our beautiful, scenic byways and our view sheds. We're concerned about the impact to the environment and the massive vegetation removal that can often accompany these projects. So we really spent quite a bit of time, years and years actually, kind of debating and talking about these various points. And where have we really landed? Well, where we've landed in Minnesota is that we've had statutory drivers that are really pushing this forward. We're getting an increase in requests for use of rights of way, and how we really conceptualize these are through the time-worn processes and utility accommodation of crossings, which of course most DOTs are like, "Yep, we got the process down." Many DOTs also have a lot of experience with transmission paralleling right outside of the right of way, which is beneficial actually because it reduces the overall footprint of a project. And that's a really good thing for landowners and for communities. But then there's this sort of co-location question of actually siting in rights of way present different challenges, but to support the clean energy transition, our rights of way have a role to play and need to be a tool in the toolbox. So in Minnesota, we had some changes to the laws in our 24 session that really, the industry, I think, sort of heard us in some of the big, sticky, stinking points. For us, we were concerned about the lack of, or just how unsafe potentially added poles could be in interstate rights of way. And so that, the now transmission is eligible to be placed within all types of rights of way through this legislative action. They also created a constructability report, which is a best practice from Wisconsin, who said to Minnesota, when y'all are done talking about it, you can come over for some cheese curds in Wisconsin because we've been allowing this for 20 years. So I encourage for you to connect with both of us as your folksy northern neighbors. But truly, the constructability report helps ensure that all of the transportation questions, needs, and issues are enumerated in a report. So we need pole placements, for instance, in order to do our analysis of can we or can we not site this infrastructure, we need pole placements. That's not how transmission lines are drawn. There's lines. I don't mean that loosely, but there's lines, and it's very challenging for us to do our full due diligence without really actual pole placements, which normally come later in the process in transmission siting. So in general, the constructability report's a great best practice. And we set some boundaries around relocation, around who pays for relocation and with what time frame for notification. So it helped us understand a little bit of the lay of the land of where were we coming from. Where have we ended up? We've ended up with quite a few projects that are in the hopper in the state of Minnesota. Not all of these are co-location. In fact, many of them are crossings or other elements, but the volume that's moving through the system is very, very significant. And our writing and siting coordinator in our Office of Land Management's utility section, their plates are full with what's coming. So as part of this analysis, we kind of dove in the pool with AASHTO, with the Moonshot Initiative, to really understand how can we create replicable best practices with other states for those of you that might be contemplating what this might mean for your state. What that's meant for us is really thinking about how we can create new resources to ensure better early coordination. So the key to preserving transportation needs and rights and interests in the process is earlier coordination, not late in the process, earlier in the process. So we have more resources for that. We continue to do a safety analysis, really understanding our safety picture and what that means from our employees to contractors to the traveling public. We have identified that we need better training. We need those that develop these lines to understand transportation issues, constraints, laws, and the delivery of the transportation system. So we're putting together a training package to get everybody in the same room to talk through that. We're talking to our districts about how the law has changed, adding staff, okay, thank you, and working with our friends with the RAY, with the ESRI tool that was referenced earlier, which is a GIS tool that's attempting to bring together right-of-way data sets with natural resource and land use data sets to really, see if we can support more efficient siting. Almost finished. So as part of this, if for those of you that are interested, we have new resources on our website as part of our land management portal around project guidance, environmental guidance, additional tools for those that are proposing these projects that might be of interest to other states. And almost in closing, we be careful what you wish for in the sense of we now have projects that are being proposed that we've done a year and a half of early coordination with during the actual public engagement process with the public utility permit, because we're a downstream permitting agency. Landowners suggested, we don't think it should go there. We think it should go somewhere else. And so we did a year and a half of work to have another route get proposed that was occupancy. So the timing of this, how we negotiate this is disconcerting. So in closing, for those of you that are digging into these topics, and I think many of you, if you're transportation professionals, intuitively know all of this already, but things I would flag for all of our consideration are really around thinking through how do these types of projects impact our ITS infrastructure. There has to be additional grounding to protect those devices. What happens when they have to move or fiber has to move? The awareness among energy that there is extensive utilities in the right of way, dozens and dozens that you are not seeing. How are you contemplating that early in the planning process? Because it's already, as far as we're concerned, a very crowded space. And, you might have to relocate things like massive drainage structures, structural snow fencing, things that are really serving a transportation purpose, but might not be clear to you. We might have segments that you're proposing that we might want to turn back to locals. That would complicate the picture of a future project. We care very deeply about scenic byways and want to see respect shown for those assets. And, we also want folks to think that the notion that all right of way is just previously disturbed is not totally accurate when we think about the history of NEPA and those laws, and that sometimes those precious cultural resources and other things, folks might say it's disturbed when in reality it might not be fully disturbed. So in closing, thank you for the opportunity to chat about this. Always happy to be a resource. I want to encourage my DOT colleagues to understand how significant this is for the economies of your state, and that it's worth working through the hard issues to support the renewable energy transition. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. That was absolutely wonderful. I wonder if you wouldn't mind sending the URL for the land use portal to Christine, so that Christine could share it with the full group. I think that would be of great use to a great many people. Before I turn it over to Raj, who's up next, I just want to underscore something that I think is actually a real opportunity for project planners, and especially for folks in state DOTs and other transportation planning organizations and consultants even. You had that brilliant slide on the kinds of pressure points that come up in trying to cite energy transition infrastructure in rights of way, transportation rights of way. And those strike me as very interesting kind of questions that can be taken to, people who use these rights of ways, people who have stakes in these rights of ways, the community members, and actually ask for their advice on, solving a problem. I mean, something. The pole location is such a great example of that, right? Like landowners probably have very strong feelings about, whether you locate a pole, here or 10 yards that way, right? But I think it's a big advantage strategically and project wise. Anytime you can genuinely engage civilians, so to speak, who care about these projects as co-problem solvers, right? Oftentimes locals know, a great deal about these very granular issues, so to speak. I forgot how hard it is to avoid puns when you're talking about transportation. Granular. I'm so sorry. Raj, let me turn it over to you before I get myself in more trouble.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to everyone else. Let me share my presentation here. I believe this is it. Yeah, so I want to talk about the Sue Green project, and just so we set the record straight, some of you might after this webinar say, oh, this is so green. It's really not so green, it's Sue Green because it stands for the Soo Line, which is the US operations of Canadian Pacific Railroad, which is now Canadian Pacific Kansas City CPKC after the Kansas City Southern merger, because most of the project corridor is located in the right-of-way of CPKC. So we'll talk about this. It's an underground transmission project, which was a prerequisite to be co-located in a railroad right-of-way, considering all the hazardous, flammable, and explosive materials that railroads carry. The last thing they want is an overhead transmission line next to their moving trains in an active corridor. So what exactly is this project? That's the first question. And it's actually an interstate transmission project between Iowa, which happens to be the leading state in wind power use, and second leading state in wind power installed capacity. And for those of you who don't remember the history, the first state in the US that enacted a renewable portfolio standard back in 1983. So essentially a state that has an abundance of low-cost power generation available through renewables, primarily wind. And so it's in north central Iowa to Plano, Illinois, which happens to be in northern Illinois, which the color coding, I'll mention that in a little bit. But Illinois also has been a leader, not necessarily with the RPS, but definitely with the environmental protection, dating back to when the EPA was founded. And the Illinois state passed the first state to protect pass a comprehensive environmental protection act, and all the way to bookend to the most recent, they are a state that passed what's called the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act in 2023, in 2021, and with the goal of carbon-free power grid by 2045 and retiring significant, about half the fossil fuel fired power generation in Illinois by 2030. So that is the landscape under which we have developed this project, and it is besides being interstate, it's interregional. And that's why you saw the green and the blue in Illinois. Illinois actually have two regional transmission organizations, PJM, or what used to stand for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland, which is the Northeastern Power Grid for the Chicagoland, Northern Illinois area, and MISO that Jessica talked about, which is the Mid-Continental Independent System Operator that spans all the way from Manitoba in Canada down to New Orleans, Louisiana, and most of the Midwest, and it connects these two regional grids. And because it's a grid-connected transmission project, we can, if the economics make sense, we can wheel power from anywhere in MISO, which could be from the Dakotas or from Minnesota, besides Iowa. And we could wheel it on the other end from anywhere, not just in northern Illinois, but to other PJM markets, if the economics make sense. What is the project? It's a underground project that is entirely in the transportation right-of-way, as I mentioned. and it's a 525 kilovolt, so state-of-the-art underground, and it's direct current transmission, which is very critical because direct current is energy efficient power transmission, which generates very little heat, and because of that it can be located underground without melting the cable or without having to use liquid coolants and making the infrastructure more complicated. It's 350 plus miles. Most of it in the railroad corridor. The reason I say transportation right of way is there are sections where we built the railroad back in the 1850s where we wouldn't dare to do any construction activity today. Back then, the Irish and Chinese railroad workers were quite dispensable, and so we from constructively reasons, we in northeastern Iowa, we are not building along the railroad corridor. We come off and we worked with Iowa DOT and got utility installation permits, which Iowa allows for an undivided highway. And also there's one municipality where there really isn't a railroad right of way at all. They paved all the way up to the railroad tracks to the steel. So they asked us if we could move off the railroad and go along basically the main business corridor, which is another state DOT highway, and we are getting a DOT installation permit there. And on the last miles coming into Illinois, we do have some road right of way construction. We don't refer to it as a transmission line because it's not bare conductor. It's transmission cables because it's entirely shielded and insulated with the extruded crosslink polyethylene. It's essentially submarine grade. These are the cables that they developed to use for offshore wind projects in the North Sea and in New England and elsewhere. It's 2100 megawatts nameplate capacity, meaning it can generate enough power to power about 1 million homes, 13 terawatt hours a year, or to use the other analogy Jessica talked about and Tina talked about, one data center, quantum computing or AI data center. So that's it's symmetric bipole, meaning there are two equal size cables, 5-inch cables, and it's DC. One is positive, one is negative polarity. But in the really flip of a switch, we can transmit the entire power in the other direction if needed for a weather emergency. So market-driven power will flow from Iowa to Illinois. But in a weather emergency like a polar vortex sweeping down and shortage in the MISO market, we can deliver power from PJM to MISO. We can essentially double the amount of power that transfer capacity that's currently there between PJM and MISO. It is using the latest technology, which is multi-level modular converters, voltage source conversion as opposed to line converters, line commutator converters. So it's the latest technology and HVDC, which is not very common in the US. Tina did mention Chippy or the Champlain Hudson Power Express. There have been shorter underground projects across the San Francisco Bay and across Long Island Sound and other places, but not a long terrestrial project like this, although we are building a lot of them in Europe and Asia in particular. So why are we doing this? Because DOE, when they did the National Transmission Needs Study, they identified the Midwest as a bottleneck in terms of interregional transmission capacity. Midwest to the Mid-Atlantic is critical. Midwest to the Plain States is critical. So we are meeting a need, and there is currently congestion, and there's a lot of negative pricing for wind power that's generated in Iowa because of this, because they can't move the power to market where it's needed, even though Iowa is leading, or 60% of the electricity use in 2023 came from wind power. Iowa, of course, has had also a goal for exporting wind power and sharing the benefits of that with Iowa ratepayers, so that helps. And besides that, there's been a partnership between the Midwestern governors. Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds started this. It's called MidGrid 2035. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz continued with it. And now Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker has the mantle to basically improve coordination between regions, between the states, as opposed to between regional transmission organizations, which have had a hard time to parse the cost allocation for interregional transmission projects, because the value proposition, as you will see in the rest of this presentation, is very different for the extraction state and for the injection state. So a quick disclaimer. I'm not an electrical engineer. I'm an environmental engineer. I spent 4 decades working in the private sector. So I will walk you through the environmental engineer's perspective of what this transmission project is like, if you will humor me. So from a perspective of an environmental engineer, you look at the environmental professional field, it started off basically as legacy environmental services, which is basically cleaning up the mess we made in the past, whether it is Love Canal or Superfund sites or it's the oops, right? It's like, let's do it, let's clean it up. It's like, let's get it right this time, what we didn't get right the first time. And an analogy for that in the electric power sector might be the transmission lines that resulted in forest fires and transmission lines that went down because of extreme weather, hurricanes and tornadoes and ice storms, and going back and fixing them. So that's fixing problems that we created from the past. And then there's the check in the box top down, and this is basically compliance, meeting environmental permit requirements, federal and state and local. There's a similar to the top down approach that Jessica talked about with the RTOs, planning projects, transmission projects and generation projects that the utilities submit to them, and then approving them, and then checking the box and making them and building them. And then third is environmental field moved into show me the money, actually taking waste and making renewable energy. That's where I spent about the third decade of my professional career, which is taking waste and making renewable natural gas, and then taking some of that gas and offsetting natural gas, fossil gas use, and also taking some of the gas and putting it in Caterpillar engines and making electricity and sending it to the grid. These projects have to show the business value, internal business value, in terms of how much do we invest and what is the return on these projects. And the environmental field has been pretty good at tackling that, whether it is on wind and solar project generation or air pollution control or water pollution control and all these aspects in terms of extracting more value out of what used to be liabilities before. And then lastly, there's the who's picking up the tab. I've often asked the question, wait, you're doing an underground high HVDC project. Isn't that a lot more expensive? The question is, who is paying for when overhead transmission lines go down? Who is paying for the $200 billion that Texas lost in economic activity when their grid went down? Who is paying for all the restoration in Maui after the forest fires that were caused by transmission lines? What's happening in California with some of these overhead projects? And who's paying to rebuild these transmission lines once they go down? So it's not just the upfront cost of building it, it's the extreme weather related disruption and rebuilding, and the costs of grid going down and actually resulting in other unintended economic consequences to the community. And the reality is, like most of the private sector, it's privatizing profits and socializing costs. Society and FEMA and taxpayers end up picking up a lot of tab of events, and rebuilding often gets charged to the ratepayer, but that double counting is not showing up front, it's only showing up later. And these projects have 40, 60, 80 year useful life. So you just have to look at the intensity and frequency of extreme weather events, and you know that we're going to be rebuilding a lot of projects if you continue to build them the way they're built. So who's picking up the tab is very critical. It's internalizing, quantifying and monetizing the externalities that were intended or unintended, and then making sure that someone is accounting for them. Which brings to where the sustainability field is today, right? It's really about multi-capital approach. Don't think just about the financial, don't think just about the stakeholder, the shareholder, think about all stakeholders, think about human capital, social capital, and natural capital. And in the case of our project, we also paid very proactive consideration to cultural capital, both in terms of current culture, rural American culture, and making sure we protect it, whether it is view sheds or other considerations, and also historic culture. 100 miles of this project is along the Mississippi River, where there are 12 tribes with national historic interests that we engage proactively through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, archaeologists, to make sure that we meet their expectations in terms of, as Jessica said, not all these transportation corridors are fully disturbed. Some of them are even undisturbed from many perspectives. And political capital, what could get better than connecting a red trifecta state like Iowa to a blue trifecta state like Illinois to deliver economic value on one end and to deliver all the environmental benefits on the other end. So we are definitely addressing preserving the political capital in this whole infrastructure game. So how are we doing this? I'll walk through these different forms of capital. Financial capital. There's wholesale electricity prices. Wind blows a lot faster in Iowa, which means it's much, much cheaper to generate wind power in Iowa. And then there is REC values, or renewable electricity certificates. And then there's capacity markets, how much reserve capacity is there available. Jason got it, 2 minutes. And value of ancillary services, HVDC provides other power quality and other grid services that often are not currently valued in the market. But if you add all of these up, there is enough money in there to plan an bottom-up merchant transmission project or a tollway for power transmission, as opposed to a top-down RTO plan project. And we're doing this because of all the purple, all the high wind speed, all the way from El Paso, Texas, up to North Dakota, east of the Rockies. As I mentioned, Illinois has a goal that helps with the financial capital too, because they're going to be retiring a lot of fossil fuel power plants by 2030 and entirely go carbon free for the electric power by 2045. The health benefits that we deliver are quantified and monetized in Illinois. We have committed to organized labor for the project, both construction, operating engineers, and the electrical IBEW. We're committed to workforce development, working with community colleges, because building an underground transmission line is quite new in North America, so we need to train the workforce. We are also prioritizing hiring locally and hiring people from disadvantaged communities, returning citizens, veterans, and people previously incarcerated, and all of that. We're also, as I mentioned, the dollar value, it's a $4 billion project, but there's almost $10 billion in health benefits just from NOx and SOx emissions and particulates in Illinois for the power that we will deliver. And there is close to another $10 billion in social cost of carbon associated with when these fossil fuel plants that we can replace. And then there's the social capital aspect of land rights. A lot of pushback is about eminent domain authority and taking over productive agricultural land, farmland, and ranch land, and we avoid that completely. We have economic development, not just in Iowa and Illinois, but in other states, which I'll mention quickly. And we are working on community development projects. Communities have said, hey, you're along the railroad corridor. It's really tough to co-locate projects with the railroad. It takes us almost a decade. Can you help us, since you already have a relationship with the railroad? And we have done it. Mason City and Dubuque, the two largest cities, we are laying down fiber for the city's use to become the digital city of the future along our transmission line. And we are onshoring a lot of manufacturing. The greatest example is we are actually going to build the first HVDC cable manufacturing in South Carolina through Prysmian, an Italian cable manufacturer. And there is a significant benefit. This is on the Iowa side, which is generation and construction of the project and the new wind projects and solar projects that will come with it, and also avoiding disruption of the grid. And then on the Illinois side, there is beyond these other benefits, there's also downstream activity, because there's a lot of data centers and quantum computing goals that Illinois has that they don't have the power for today. And I mentioned the retirement of the fossil fuel plants. If you had to build plants in Illinois to replace them, you have to build 88 projects and use 144,000 acres of land. So stuff that is tough to get in a very short time frame. Grid reliability is very critical, and HVDC in particular for interregional and inter-RTO, intergrid transmission is very reliable in terms of being able to dispatch the power where it is exactly needed, things that cannot be done with traditional AC transmission. And lastly, the high output from our project will avoid additional investment that Illinois will have to incur for the decarbonization. So there is a avoidance cost that's associated. And Illinois Power Authority actually estimated that we will reduce the loss of load estimate for the state of Illinois from 0.1% down to 0.01%, and that the line will be used 96% of the time, which is very rare for transmission lines. And so from a natural capital perspective, I mentioned we are underground. We have a very narrow impact corridor. We only have environmental impact during construction, not during operation. We avoid extreme weather events. It's resilient for that. And we do a lot of trenchless construction in environmentally sensitive areas to avoid aquatic life impact and habitat impacts. And we are very sensitive to environmental justice considerations across the entire project. So physically, this is what the project looked like. Cables actually laid inside conduits. So 5-inch cables inside 8-inch conduits, and they, as I said, insulated and shielded, so you don't have to worry about nuisance currents and unintended induced voltages and corona discharge and humming noise in your AM radio and all these other things that come with overhead high voltage power transmission. So reliability and resiliency, that's really what it is. And robustness. We don't know what our power generation grid is going to look 20 years, 30 years from now. And HVDC technology will adapt to changing power generation mix. Just like we did on the material use side with reduce, reuse, and recycle, we think we have to build reliable, resilient, and robust power transmission. And that's what we are trying to do here. Lastly, I will leave you with these images because this is where the market is going. There's a company that is developing batteries, lithium batteries that will be in rail cars that will charge up these batteries with wind and solar power and then move them by rail, BNSF and Union Pacific Railroad, to where the load is. And then there's a company in Switzerland that's actually laying solar panels using rail as the mechanism to lay down the panels between the railroad tracks. And there's a million kilometers of railroad tracks around the world that's unused infrastructure. So there's a lot of interesting things that are happening out there. I will stop with that, and we'll be glad to answer any questions that you have for the whole group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raj. That was just wonderful. I learned a ton from you, and I'm sure everyone did. I want to open the floor to questions from the audience. As a group, folks have already been wonderfully active in posing questions, and I want to thank Jessica and Tina and Raj and Christine for already jumping in to answer some of those questions of clarification. Maybe as our audience collects their thoughts and readies themselves to pose questions to you. I could, take the speaker's privilege and ask a question of my own. And this came up to my mind in listening to each of your presentations. I'm curious if maybe you could say a word about a failed project or a failed part of a project, and what you learned from that. Maybe it's a communication challenge between state departments, for instance, getting transportation folks and energy folks talking to each other. Maybe it's a failed community engagement meeting, or maybe it's a project that falls apart as a project for another reason. I think we learned a ton from success cases, no doubt, and those are also just good for the morale. Who doesn't love hearing about success cases? But I wonder if you could talk about what you learned from some failures as well.
All right, you guys are quiet. Maybe Tina, you were going to say something. Go ahead, and then I'll jump in after that.
Well, I was thinking of it's not necessarily failures, but more like never really got started. So when I was at Federal Highway Administration a few years ago, we had these peer exchanges among state DOTs to learn from each other on deploying solar energy along highways. And so we had Massachusetts presenting on their experience. We had Texas and Utah and Minnesota, Maryland, and others were very interested and engaged. And Minnesota went on to do wonderful things, and Maryland has wonderful things in the works. But some of the states, who participated, they had great ideas, but we haven't seen anything come of them yet. And part of that is just how many different people it takes to get together, how difficult it is to, try to get a large public agency whose mission has traditionally been building highways to now decide they want to install solar panels when there's nobody telling them that they have to. So the places where we have seen agencies step up and do these projects are ones where their governor's office is like, show me what you can do, make it happen. But there's several who, have bright and motivated staff and see the benefits and, they have interest in making it happen, but haven't been able to make it happen. They've got other things in their job for a lot of the staff that participated. Their job was perhaps in the environmental office, primarily working on NEPA, and this would be like a little side project. So we have seen more success from state DOTs that have a sustainability office. So yeah, so there's some thoughts.
A couple of things, Jason. I will specifically talk about transmission. Transmission projects, it's a marathon to develop and build transmission projects. It's not a sprint. And there are three particular aspects that have been challenges. One, first, I'll talk about long linear transmission projects, right? Not short ones that connect a generator to the grid, but this is connecting regional grids and moving power from one region to another. In general, as I mentioned, the RTOs, the regional transmission organizations, haven't really figured out the value proposition, how to share it and allocate costs to the exporter and the importer. So because of this, almost all long linear interregional projects have been merchant projects. So tollways, right? And they went private sector venture funded. And the biggest opposition they run into is to demonstrate the certificate of public need and public use in states. And states, particularly states where land rights are very sensitive, the eminent domain authority for merchant projects has been fought tooth and nail by many communities. And in many cases, rightfully so, because they're concerned about the impact the project's going to have to their community from their rural lifestyle. And that's one. And then the environmental piece. These projects last for a very long time. And we don't know how the natural habitat for migratory birds or bats or turtles is going to change over the next 30 years due to a changing climate. And how to assess, under the NEPA review, how to assess the long-term environmental impacts of this. So there's been a lot of push, a lot of uncertainty around environmental permitting. So there's been a lot of push to try and quote unquote fine tune and try to shorten the environmental permitting process.
Streamline.
And we know we take those shortcuts, we're gonna come back and we're gonna redo things because we took shortcuts. So that's a second challenge. And the third challenge is about the power delivered itself. There is a lot of the market forces change quite a bit in both the ends. And because of this, the priorities of the private sector venture capitalists change. So many of these projects go through wonderful development, get land rights, 100% site control, get environmental permits, and then don't get built because there is the last piece of how much the rest of the grid needs to get upgraded to accommodate this interregional project. So what they call system impact study and facility studies done by the regional organization. And there was just a project in New England, for example, recently, after over almost a decade of fighting to get a project down to get renewables from Quebec down into Massachusetts. Yep. The project died in its vine because the capitalists folded up their bag and left because the system upgrade costs from Massachusetts was enormous compared to so they had a sticker shock. So those are the three things that cause projects to fail. So it's very important to stay on top of what impact are you going to have on the existing grid, what impact are you going to have on the environment, and what impact are you going to have on landowners along the corridor. This is not flyover country. We need to take very strong considerations of this very early on.
Thank you. Jessica, I know MnDOT never fails at anything that it tries. So maybe you can speak about the experiences of some friends.
Well, we actually have a big list of things we've failed at and tried, and I think we're always trying to push to go further. But I mean, I think this topic is so interesting, and even to Tina's question about like, is this stuff just champion based at this stage, I think is a major question. And for most of these projects, you need relationships with other agencies. And, I don't know that a lot of other state DOTs, that they're in the business of how to make our work more complicated with energy. But you really need deep relationships in order to have honest conversations and try to start to build trust. And you need to view the work as interdisciplinary. But I think that I'm actually not a natural born transportation person. I come from a housing and community development background. And I think that we don't have the luxury of just saying, well, it's just transportation. Housing's not really my problem, or these other, elements, because what we're trying to achieve are complex problems. And you actually need solutions that cross many industries, whether that's housing and health, or health and transportation, or energy and transportation. These are complicated issues, but also have a lot of opportunities. So I hope that we can maybe get out of the partisan space too, that this is just, this is about enough electricity to power our economies. And if we will be dead in the water, if we don't figure out how to do that in red states and blue states and the rest. So whether it's saving money, generating revenue, whatever it might be, there are interests to me that every state should care deeply about. And so there are good reasons to figure out these complicated relationships. And I agree that executive level champions help. But we could go a long way towards building more trust and having stronger relationships with folks, because there's not a lot of trust between utilities and transportation agencies. The list of talk to the folks at the TRB utility committee, and they'll tell you about the complexity and the cost of how utilities impact the delivery of the transportation system. So we have some work to do. We have some work to do with relationship building.
Well, something, speaking of relationships, that came through very clearly in all three presentations is actually the role of civil society actors. The role of organizations like the Ray, the role of other organizations that advocate, for these kinds of projects. It sounds like community-based organizations like that, or at least like kind of nonprofit, NGO kind of advocacy style organizations, they too can be important champions that it sounds like may play some similar roles to a top-down push from the executive, right? It's interesting, Raj. One thing we heard when we did the study of Hydro-Quebec is that lots of people in northern New England would ask, well, why don't you do what they're doing, in the Champlain project? So an interesting kind of spillover of awareness here and there.
It is so interesting that in Ireland and in England, in the UK, there were public meetings where people raised their hands and said, why don't you build a project like Sue Green that is all underground in a transportation corridor? Why don't you build a project like Champlain Hudson that is submarine? And it's getting attention around the world, and particularly because here it's something new that we're doing, right? They're doing it in Europe. They bought offshore wind power from the Baltic and the North Sea down into the industrial belt of southern Germany through underground transmission projects. China has done a phenomenal amount of underground HVDC projects. So it's not that it hasn't been done elsewhere. There are lessons to be learned to how it is done. Question is, can you de-risk it enough for people to plunk private sector money to do it? It's not just that you got the right of way, but what is the relocation risk? The projects have 40, 60, 80-year useful life. Will another lane be added to a highway, and are they going to ask you to move? If they're going to ask you to move, are they going to give you that adjacent right of way to move to? And if the answer is no, it's very difficult to go to a bank and get the project financed to build. It's so answering all this, not just securing the right of way first, but making sure that if you have to move from the current right of way to something adjacent, that you will be guaranteed access to that adjacent land, so that the project can generate revenue throughout its useful life for the original investors.
Mm-hmm. Thought I had seen another question come up in the Q&A, but maybe I did not. That's strange. I get change in the numbers, but then okay, no, sorry, I see it now. One of the questions that Heather Richardson has asked is the relationship between ecological change, right? You know, kind of planning, incorporating planning for environmental changes, extreme weather events. And so, I'm curious how you see the challenges of resilience in energy systems relating to challenges of resilience in transportation systems. I would imagine that the issues might be different, and so how do you deal with those differences?
I think those resiliency questions are really tricky widgets as we talk about transmission, because in certain regions, as we think about the need for regions with high wildfire risk and undergrounding, and the 12, we were quoted that the undergrounding costs 12 times the cost of above ground transmission, that isn't politically
Mm,
feasible in certain ways. But to me, in Minnesota, with our climate shifting, often that means extreme rain events, more frequent. And so flooding presents different issues than areas with high wildfire risk. So this question of undergrounding and when
mm,
that tool is used, I think is really tricky, because many transportation folks are like, well, let's just bury it all. Let's require that it's all buried. Then no one has to die on a pole, which
mm,
is very simplistic, but not the right answer. And so I think
mm.
um, I would just say undergrounding and flooding versus fires and other types of risk are very different
Yeah,
for the transportation
yeah,
and energy systems, but
mm,
risky for all of us if we do nothing
yeah,
also,
yeah.
right?
Well, but another motivation for a place-based approach to these problems, in a hyper-local kind of way. Um, I'm curious about the question that Tessin Malik, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, asks about experiences with FHWA or other federal agencies regarding interstate highway infrastructure. Do any of you have experience working through those issues? I think the question is specifically about working with FHWA on installing EV charging stations in parking lots that are in the state right of way, but under interstate bridges.
I want to defer to Tina, but Tina might be waiting for me to comment here. We wouldn't allow this because we're concerned about EV charging under bridges due to the fire risk. And
Mm,
that is, of course, also not just the issue of the federal prohibition on the servicing of motor vehicles and interstate rights of way, which remain a barrier in statute to the charging infrastructure.
Can you say a little bit more about that? I think people who come at this more from the energy side might not have as clear an understanding of what you just said as people who come at it from the transportation side.
Tina, as a recent federal, would you like, I defer to you on this, but
So you're talking about the prohibition on servicing services for motor vehicles in interstate right away. Um, so basically, people would think it might be great to put electric vehicle charging stations at interstate highway rest areas. Why not? Sounds great, right? But there's actually a prohibition on that. And the original, this is many decades old. The original idea is that there were existing gas stations and truck stops, and they didn't want to lose business. Um, it's sort of continued on, although there are like um, some older highways that are grandfathered in and they don't have to deal with that. But most of them do have to deal with this, and it is a barrier. Um, you know, it's something that if Congress wants to change, they could change it. And there would be a policy argument to say You know, you could put out a competitive request for proposals, and truck stop operators and gas station operators and EV charging companies could, or land developers could put in proposals to basically lease and operate an interstate rest area. And then they would provide, you know, restrooms and food and gas station and EV charging, similar to what you see in other countries or on turnpikes that are not, don't have this restriction. So that could be done, but it's currently prohibited.
Speaking of things that Congress can do, I wanted to offer up the question that our anonymous attendee asked regarding the reconciliation bill. Anyone following what the reconciliation bill would mean for speed and scalability of citing?
Yeah, so Atlas Public Policy has definitely been following the reconciliation bill closely, and it would phase out and remove a lot of the tax incentives for clean manufacturing facilities, the tax credits for electric vehicle purchases. It also has in it an electric vehicle registration fee at the federal level, which would be punitive to EV drivers and charge them a lot more than their gas driver equivalents. So it's definitely a hit for clean transportation. It passed the House. We'll still have to see what the Senate does. And it's basically an issue of, you know, a lot of these clean energy incentives have benefits for congressional districts and states, economic benefits and job benefits. But what we saw in the House was that members of Congress were prioritizing tax cuts over clean energy investments, essentially. In terms of impact for transmission and for solar, we've mostly been focusing on impact for electric vehicles. I'm not sure on impact for solar or transmission, but maybe my colleagues have thoughts on that. Although I imagine tariffs for solar panels would be an issue, making it less, the return on investment much less.
Well, maybe I could conclude by bringing in Harris Edwards's kind of overarching question, which is about barriers, you know, currently to, you know, even broader implementation of siting energy transition infrastructure and transportation rights of way. I mean, I think, you know, as I was listening to your presentations, the things that struck me were the organizational and social barriers of finding ways for people in different communities of practice to communicate with each other, you know, across the division of labor that, you know, necessarily exists in state and other agencies. So, you know, I think I'd suspect that that's something that cuts across. But, you know, if you were to wave a magic wand and, you know, get one problem or one barrier out of the way, what would you wave that wand at?
So I will mention, I'll wave the wand twice. One on the road side, road right of way, DOT road right of way side. There are a lot of states that do not allow co-location of power transmission, or even for, like in Iowa, you can't even get flowing liquids and fluids through divided highways. right of way of divided highways, and many states only allow. Iowa allows it an undivided highway. Wisconsin and was a leader in allowing it in all the highways, but that's one challenge, policy challenge that has to be addressed across all states. And then with the other piece is with the railroads. It's the the big thing is, unlike DOT rights of way that are almost always owned fee simple by the state DOTs, railroads have a patchwork quilt of underlying land ownership. Some of it they own fee simple, some of it they have an easement, some of it they have a license, some operating license, some of it is just by occupancy. And so when we, for example, the Iowa Farm Bureau and some landowners challenged the idea. They said our great grandfather, when they gave the railroad the right of way, they did not intend for a power transmission line. It was just for a rail line. And the Iowa Utilities Commission said, we are not in the business of adjudicating land rights. If you have to do it, you have to go do it in courts. And of course, federal law is very clear with railroads, saying that only it doesn't matter who owns the underlying land, only the railroad can determine what happens in that right of way. But there might need to be some clarity there in terms of if it is owned by somebody else, can we make it clear that the railroad can allow power transmission infrastructure to be located in there? But it's not something individual projects should have to try to battle in individual locations. It could be some clarification that federal government could make in that space.
Okay, I'm going to wave and then you can wave, Tina. We'll go in opposite order. So I really think that I view, Jason, how you're reading these situation is that, to me, the barriers are cultural, not technical. We do have legislative and policy barriers and things of that nature. But I think if we want to figure out how to site this infrastructure, we can. I think the patchwork of states' utility accommodation approaches and policies, to Raj's point about fee versus easement, at some point there'll be a legal challenge of, is utility accommodation on an easement property, is transmission really covered by that? Or is transmission beyond the scope of what normal utility accommodation would look like? So I do think that there's a basket of issues, but I think most of the opposition is cultural, in my view. We can figure out the other things, but there's a high degree of coordination that's required because the benefits are so great for our country. I think we can get there. I think we're far at the other end culturally of what that can look like.
Yeah, I agree with Jessica. If I could wave my wand, it would be on the cultural and kind of the focus of transportation agencies, and waving the wand to have everybody think more broadly about how they can benefit their community and how what they do and the assets they manage can provide multiple benefits, not just a transportation benefit, but also transition to clean energy benefit.
Very well said, everyone. I'm going to go get some magic wands and post them off to you. I want to thank our panelists for really marvelous contributions to the conversation about citing energy transition infrastructure and transportation rights of way. I think I learned a ton. I'm sure our audience did too. We will be posting the video of the webinar online. A link to that will follow to the email list, and so everyone should stay tuned for the next webinar in this series.